Coming up, the New York Football Giants are preparing for the century season as they will have a night with the legends, fans, and familiar faces from the past for Big Blue. What does it all mean, and why does the fan base care so much about these uniforms? Plus, another running back brought in. Is this reflective of what the Giants did not accomplish on draft day? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it is OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that we are your hosts. Over here, Adam Armbrecht. Over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. And first and foremost, Andy, with running back rooms and draft day discussions and all kinds of things, we get to what is supposed to be a celebration for the New York Football Giants and a great opportunity, if you are a season ticket holder, to be around some of the best in franchise history tomorrow night for the Giants.
Yeah, it should be exciting, Adam. Tomorrow night, 6:30 at the theater at Madison Square Garden. The Giants are celebrating 100 seasons, and you're going to have the who's who of who are relevant and celebrity Giants, basically. You've got John Mara, Joe Shane, plus we've got Eli Manning, Tom Coughlin will be back, Harry Carson, Bill Parcells is going to be in the building, Tiki Barber, Jason Sehorn. I heard Victor Cruz and others are going to be there. Some of the more contemporaries are obviously going, as well as a ton of the Giants from the 2024 season. I think while we know training camp ended or mandatory minicamp ended last week, a lot of the Giants decided to stick around because this is such an important event to the New York Giants that after this event, they're kind of going to go take their summer vacations, do whatever they need to do. But it's amazing whether you're a fan that's 75 years old or 7 years old. There's going to be a bunch of players here that you have at least seen that have gotten excited about and have made spectacular plays, catches, touchdown passes all throughout the Giants' 100 years.
Yeah, it's awesome, man. I mean, listen, it comes at a time of the franchise where the success on the field has not been as great. But you mentioned some of the names there. It's like, hey, the most recent success rate, yeah, that's going to be Eli Manning. And then, even in the pre-Eli Manning and Amani Toomer and others along that line, but even beyond that, then you go back to the Tiki Barber era and you say, well, remember, okay, it wasn't the ultimate success, but that team had success. They appeared in a Super Bowl, right? So there are all these iterations. Kerry Collins, the build up to what was the return to championship level play for this franchise. And then when you mention guys like Bill Parcells and Harry Carson and some of the older generations, it's like sometimes things work out really well when you celebrate your 100th year at a time where, I don't want not to be glib, this is early in the show, but 10 more years from now, you might not be able to celebrate as many of those former players, or especially someone like Coach Bill Parcells, who is certainly not a spring chicken at this point. And there with Tom Coughlin too, like being able to celebrate those coaches when we look at the Giants organization and that position and that stability that those coaches brought in their 10 years, that's something that I think you want to really be able to honor as well. I mean, it's an excellent occasion if you're a Giants fan and you get to attend this.
Yeah, you absolutely love it. And Adam, just so people that are aware, tickets are $25 at Madison Square Garden Theater tomorrow night. 6:30 is when it begins. And if you think about what they're doing, here's how it's set up, Adam. They're doing a 100-season celebration, so they'll go through like the journey of the New York Giants. They're going to actually do a whole 2024 season preview with Joe Shane. Then they're going to go to the championships. They're going to go to those banner years where you'll see Bill Parcells out there talking about Lawrence Taylor and other players. You're going to see Eli Manning out there with Tom Coughlin talking about, the catch with David Tyree, for instance. And so you go from the championships, then you go into the top moments in New York Giants history. It could be, Michael Strahan breaking the sack record. It could be a whole host of things. And then, finally they rounded out with Q&A that you can ask some of your favorite players, some of the different questions. I think the way that they're setting this up is great. You mentioned the product on the field has not been good for the last decade. And this is just a way to get the fans feeling good, getting nostalgic about the good old times, the top players, the top plays, the championship seasons. We just wanted to highlight it because it is important. This is the 100th season. There's a lot of scrutiny and criticism about what the Giants have done so far in regards to the 100th season that I don't really understand. I would be shocked if anyone says, like, this is terrible. I don't understand why they're doing this right now.
No, and they got 3-foot posters I think they're gonna have up there of all these key moments, throughout the years and stuff. And it is a reminder too, maybe as Andy and I, who are in our well, we'll say in our 30s, because that still counts technically. But it's easy to think about, we've had the highs and lows, winning championships in our lifetime, also seeing them be one of the worst teams in the league, frankly. But over 100 years, it's a reminder that when you are one of the historic franchises of the NFL, sometimes it's never as grim as it looks in the moment. And I don't think we would have been sitting there talking about a 9-7 team in the New York Football Giants with Eli Manning when they won the first championship with him and Tom Coughlin, right? That came out of nowhere. So sometimes the success for a team and turning the corner is a lot closer than you realize. So a little bit of nostalgia, a little bit of energy. And they are, I think, also going to preview the Hard Knocks. They're also going to get a preview of that tomorrow night as well, which officially starts the beginning of July. And we're going to be talking about that on the podcast too. But I think it's great. I'm usually not one, the pomp and circumstance of it all. But if you're in the room walking around with that swath of Giants, on-field royalty, so to speak, it's pretty cool. And the Giants are known to do a pretty good job with things like this over the years when it comes to giving something back maybe to the fan base and letting them know, hey, this is what we've accomplished and what we're hoping to get back to once again.
Yeah, Adam, I love it. It's fascinating because, for as bad as the Giants have been, we forget about some of the history that you mentioned before. Like over the 100 years, you think of the Pittsburgh Steelers as like, one of the preeminent blue bloods of the NFL, and the Giants have stunk. But since 2008, the Pittsburgh Steelers and the New York Giants have the same amount of Super Bowls. It's just they're more often than not with Mike Tomlin at 8-8, 9-8, like breaking close to the playoffs, where the Giants have these high highs and low seasons. Adam, the one thing I did want to touch on is, that there was a lot of controversy when the Century Red uniforms came out that the Giants are going to be wearing opening game against the Minnesota Vikings. People said they hate it. They can't stand it. Why would they pick this? I think Art Stapleton of NorthJersey.com, he basically came out and said, look, they're not trying to create some modernized alternate uniform. They went back into the bag, looked into the 20s and 30s, and took different components to actually tip the cap to what the older generation, older teams were 100 years ago. It's not supposed to be some modernized version of it. I can't understand why people are getting so upset about that either.
Oh, no, listen, if you follow the podcast, I don't really care much about this type of stuff. I think that the uniforms are funky. I think they've got a lot of different elements. You go and look at all the different historical eras. You can identify little tips here and there. Do I think they executed it perfectly? No. I think they could have picked a different style of helmet and different type of pants, and it would have all come together in the same way. That being said, these are not the going forward alternate jerseys or uniforms for this team. It was a celebration of 100 years of the New York Football Giants. And guess what? I don't know. If you're a fan that's like, I can't believe I'm going to watch these things opening night against the Minnesota Vikings, I don't know what to tell you. So on the one hand, I'm celebrating you, the fan base. I'm celebrating the Giants organization. And then on the other, I'm telling you to get over it. It's a uniform. And if you think that those things are tied to whether or not a team is good or bad, or they play a good game or not, it's not. It's not the case. We've heard from players. Some of the players said, hey, hard to have a lot of swag when you're walking around in this type of uniform, but it's still really cool, the history, blah, blah, blah. That's all that it is. It's just celebrating 100 years, and then you can move on from it after opening night, potentially.
Adam, the last thing I'll say is, how you make the jerseys look like swagalicious, swagadocious? You know how you do it? You win games. Like when you win games in any uniform, you're like, those things are amazing. Right? Like it doesn't really matter. So I'm with you. Ultimately, 100-year, you're going to hear a lot of this. There's going to be different things throughout the season where they celebrate it. Right now, as we have this kind of lull in the off-season program for the Giants, enjoy hearing your favorite stories from everyone during the Night of Legends tomorrow night, Madison Square Garden Theater.
And think about a different term other than swagalicious, because that can't be right. That there's no world that operates correctly. Coming up here in a second, though, other things that happen for the New York Football Giants are bringing in a UFL stud running back, which actually just opened up more questions about what's going on in the running back room for the Giants, and some information out of Carolina that suggests maybe there had been a different plan on draft day that I almost did it. I've been talking Nets this morning, Andy, that Joe Shane and the Giants wanted to but could not accomplish. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment. As we continue OGP today, we remind you today's episode is brought to you by Personam. Personam is an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine that improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant, always learning. Check out Personam today. And Andy, Sailors, wouldn't you know it? After the draft and after free agents were brought in and after Devin Singletary was signed initially, the New York Football Giants tried to rebuild this running back room. What does it say that they went and grabbed another player that does have some NFL ties with the Bengals and one other team previously in Sailors who just concluded his
Falcons.
UFL season? Falcons, there you go.
Yep, he was undrafted, but spent a little bit of time with the Bengals and the Falcons during training camp. He's never played an NFL game, but obviously, he had a great stint in the UFL. Adam, he averaged about 4.9 yards per carry, had 5 touchdowns rushing, 3 more receiving in 9 games. So he's almost averaging a touchdown a game on almost 5 yards a carry. It's interesting because it signifies something about the Giants still wanting to bolster this running back room. But
Mhm.
also, Sailors had a bunch of interest across the league. And he looked around and was like, where is my best opportunity to potentially
Yeah.
get snaps? And he picked the Giants. So, like, when you think about it from the other version of it, it's not like, wow, the Giants got this guy. It's like, well, why did they get him? It's because he thinks that there's still opportunity in this room.
Of course. And listen, he's only 24 years old. You mentioned 460 yards on just 94 carries, 5 touchdowns, 3 receiving touchdowns to go along with it, and minimal receiving yardage. But the other part of it, too, was also looking inside of what his value is inside of this room. And you mentioned, hey, bad teams or teams that have a lot of openings at positions are often favorable when players like this come up. Turbo Miller, right? Why are we excited about what the backup running back position could look like behind Devin Singletary? Because there's an opportunity after you have a player like Saquon Barkley, and now you open the field up. But when you look now at that running back room, what is supposed to be made out of this now? And does it feel like, because we're going to get to this draft piece of it, but does it feel like basically what you're seeing right now from the Giants? Two things. One, that they're just willing to take flyers on guys, relatively young guys, and give them a chance and see if they can be a contributor. That's fine. And then two, that they are kind of trying to avoid going to the veteran running back well in free agency at any point, even if it ends up being maybe low cost. Do you think that these two things are correlated, or are we still too early in the offseason to say that any of these players have a definite path here to the roster?
It's tough because you have some guys that draft capital has been invested in guys like Eric Gray and guys like Tyrone Tracy. Then you have guys like Turbo Miller who may have been drafted had he been eligible for the draft. The Giants get him as a kind of like a preferred free agent signing
Mhm.
after all of the stuff that we talked about before with his eligibility in college. And then you have Jashaun Corbin, who we love that the Giants signed after the draft last season. Bounced around, played a little bit for the Carolina Panthers, came back, and now I mentioned Turbo Miller, but now all of a sudden we have Jacob Sailors in the mix as well.
Yeah.
I'm going to be honest, it feels like the Giants are trying to throw a lot of paint at the wall and hoping that it dries into a Picasso right now because it doesn't feel like there is a direction that the Giants have in this room because and I think at least credit to the Giants, it feels like each of these different players has a different particular skill set. I wouldn't say they
Sure.
have 4 guys that are the same backing up Devin Singletary, where you're like, why are we having so much redundancy? You think about Dante Miller's speed, think about Tyrone Tracy's pass catching ability out of the backfield. You think about Eric Gray being able to, although he didn't show it in the NFL, in college, was obviously a really good pounding rusher down the middle. And Jacob Sailors, I think he was from East Tennessee.
Yeah.
You know, obviously not much in the rushing, in the passing game, but certainly in the rushing game. I like the compliment that all of them bring. They're bringing in competition, but it still feels like there is a ton of question marks behind Devin Singletary right now.
Oh, you better believe it. 26 years old, Devin Singletary, and then it's 24 for Jacob Sailors, 24 for Tyrone Tracy Jr., 24 for Eric Gray, 23 for Jashaun Corbin, right? So you're talking about everybody behind Singletary, the only established player in this room, really, by any measure, and then all of these other guys. And to your point about, draft capital invested or not, this is always the interesting thing to me. Before because I want to get to this draft day scenario that didn't really play out for the New York Giants as they had hoped. But it's always interesting to me to think about where you spent draft capital and then how you perceive it going forward, right? So when you talk about mid, late round picks where you've brought in running backs over the last couple of seasons, okay, how much do the Giants look at that and go, well, we need to have these players be successful? Eric Gray being one of them. While we perceive going back to last season that the idea was in the long term, Saquon Barkley is not going to be a New York football giant. It doesn't mean at the right price point he wouldn't be brought back. And I think sometimes, especially when it comes to Eric Gray or Deshaun Corbin, who they brought back as well, those players, you're like, well, if we're bringing back Saquon Barkley, we can just see kind of what these guys do or don't do. Now you're talking about players and saying, well, what if we really need them to be contributors? What is that going to look like? So I find that fascinating when we start to compare. We've done this before. Corbin and Gray versus Turbo Miller and Tyrone Tracy Jr. Now maybe Sailors, because now you know you didn't have Saquon Barkley coming in and Devin Singletary too, right? So you're trying to find this complementary group, and maybe also speaks to, as we know, already cutting a running back earlier this offseason as well. So all that to say, I don't know what to expect from Sailors, but given his age and given that he's had success professionally, and that's what UFL is, you have to at least like the fact that you're getting a level of experience into this room, because after Devin Singletary, there was nobody that you'd really point to and say, okay, you've had reps. You've had consistent reps where you've performed at a high level.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that because the New York Post had a good article and they said the four backups that were in OTA and minicamp plus Sailors had 18 combined career NFL rushing attempts. 17 were fifth round pick Eric Gray. So
Yep.
you're talking about like 18 total carries behind Devin Singletary. It is a huge question mark. I think the Giants know it. They're trying to cover all of their bases. And Adam, this might all have happened because of what happened during the draft for the Giants in terms of where they were picking and what their strategy could have looked like.
You better believe it. And that's what we're going to get to here in just one moment. And as a reminder, because this is a really good tidbit about Devin Singletary, remember, you go back 800 yards, almost 900 a year ago, 800, 870, 687, 775 his rookie year. But he's one of only like 4 running backs to have 800 plus yards the past 3 seasons. Joe Mixon was among them. And if you think about where he was coming into the league, like he was pretty darn close in his rookie campaign as well. That level of baseline, even if it's not superstar level, is a big part of what the Giants wanted to accomplish. Coming up, though, draft day scenarios where maybe Joe Shane kind of got snake bitten by the Carolina Panthers. We'll talk about missing out potentially on their ultimate running back goal in just one moment. Friendly reminder that the other sponsor for our show today is Pietential, Pietential. That's Pietential.com. You've heard us talk about it before. It's a free online assessment tool for individual users. It sets a baseline for your well-being, gives you tools to improve, and tracks your progress over time. Whether you're a professional athlete starting your first year in the NFL as a rookie, or a veteran that's trying to hold on to the back end of the roster, making sure that you're feeling good up top can help you feel better everywhere else in your life. So check out Potential today. And Andy, a team that had some success in the draft, at least on paper, is the Carolina Panthers, trying to make moves, trying to improve their roster that has struggled. And the reason why I say they had success is because you don't have to look too far when you know that the Carolina Panthers got a player that I had talked about a lot, felt pretty high on, liked the pedigree, and that's Xavier Legette, who they got 32nd overall at the end of the first round. But then they turned around, and we've seen some behind the scenes from them in their draft room, and said, we really want to get a running back. We're looking at the board. We knew trading back was going to cost us something somewhere. And if we want to go get who was kind of the consensus number 1 running back in the draft in Jonathon Brooks, we're going to have to move up. And they looked at the Giants, who had Brooks in for a top 30 visit, and said, we got to get ahead of him. They get to 46. They take Brooks. And then the Giants right behind them take Tyler Nubin. Do you read anything about this in terms of the Giants' top 30 visits track record and what maybe they wanted to do at the 47th pick?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating situation where we have, leading up to draft day, we talked about how important the top 30 visits were for the Giants. Each year, at least 3 players that were brought in for top 30 visits ended up being Giants. Sometimes it was 4 players. I think there was 4 players and an undrafted free agent one year. So like the top 30 visits are important in terms of what the interest is. And it can work to your benefit and your detriment, where you get an extra look at a player, you can get more conviction about them. But then other teams know that you had initial interest and that if they want that player, they have to jump in front of you. And so,
Of course.
Adam, I think I like the Tyler Nubin pick because he's a ball hawk and we're excited about it. But the way that the board fell for the Giants feels like they got snaked by a few different teams right before them, and it was kind of like, having to figure out what you were going to do. We mentioned Giants desperately needed a cornerback, and
Mhm.
going into day 2 of the NFL draft in the second round, there was plenty of cornerbacks that were available. And then all of a sudden, a funny thing happened. The Giants picked 47th. Pick 40 was Cooper DeJean, cornerback out of Iowa to the Eagles. 41 was Kool-Aid McKinstry of Alabama to the Saints. 42 was my guy, Kamari Lassiter, the cornerback from Georgia to the Houston
Yeah.
Texans. 43, Max Melton, the cornerback that you've highlighted out of
Yep.
Rutgers, went to the Arizona Cardinals. So all of a sudden, right before the Giants pick, there's 4 of the cornerbacks all of a sudden go. I think the Giants looked at it and said, we could really use a corner, but it probably doesn't make sense on our board here now. Jonathon Brooks is right around this time, and the Giants do need a running back, and maybe that changes our perception of what we think of Devin Singletary's role on this team. And then all of a sudden, the Carolina Panthers, knowing this, jumped in front of the Giants, got Jonathon Brooks, and the Giants kind of sat there and said, "Okay, who's the best player on our board? Who's the best player
Yep.
available? Let's take Tyler Nubin." That's my hypothesis on how this all went. How does that land with you?
Yeah, it's totally fine. Like, yes, like going best player available is always a good policy, especially as you say, when you're a bad team or a rebuilding team or a team that has a lot of holes on the roster. It's hard to go wrong when you go with best player available because it means you'll figure it out on the back end. But when we talk about losing Saquon Barkley, yes, bringing in Devin Singletary and then saying, well, if we could get a running back, and I'm not even, we talked about this. How early would we go running back? Is it worth it or not? We highlighted a lot of running backs that we'd be comfortable with in the 3rd and 4th round. And maybe after Tyrone Tracy Jr. was taken, it was kind of like, oh, well, watch out now. This is a guy that people were pretty high on. Maybe the Giants got a steal at that point of the draft. So this isn't about they should have done everything that they could to get Jonathon Brooks, or they should have moved up to prevent Carolina from being able to get there. But when you look down the chain reaction of it, it's okay. So you took Tyler Nubin, the safety. Then you come back around and it's going to be Andrew Phillips, and you feel very confident in him. But if running back was on that list, where would you have gone normally? And it's not even about safety or cornerback per se. It's where would you have built out your team in other ways? Now, you fast forward and you have a retirement at the tight end position. So then Theo Johnson all of a sudden is like, well, that makes a lot of sense. And we're going to talk about also, what it looks like in that room going forward over camp. So all of these things at the back end, you look back and you go, on an individual player level, I like the picks the Giants made. I like Nubin. I like Phillips. I like Johnson. I like Tyrone Tracy Jr. But from a agenda building standpoint, there can be this little seed where you go, yeah, there's a world though where the Giants wanted to go cornerback, running back was the first 2 on their board, but they don't get them till the 3rd round and the 5th round. That does change the complexion of what you wanted to accomplish versus where you stand when you come out of the draft.
Yeah, and the thing is, where do you expect these people to be? Because Adam, at the end of the day, the
Oh yeah.
Giants needed a starting cornerback, not a rotational piece. They like,
Yes.
you know,
Yes.
the Giants didn't need a tight end so you could afford to take him later. Now all of a sudden, Theo Johnson might be thrust into it. It's where you're looking for depth versus where you need someone to contribute immediately. And I think if the Giants drafted a corner like Kamari Lassiter or Kool-Aid McKinstry in the 2nd round, Cooper DeJean, they would have immediately put him on the opposite side of Deontay Banks and said, we've solved that problem. It feels like the Giants signing Trey Herndon and re-signing Darnay Holmes and doing all the things that they've done in the cornerback room signal that they're trying to do the same thing that they're doing in the running back room now with this whole committee and hoping that one of these guys, you kind of shake it and then roll out the dice and see which one it lands on. It kind of feels like the Giants didn't get their preferred path. Doesn't mean that it's not going to be a positive path moving forward. Just feels like the ideal path got blocked by a couple of picks in front of them, and the Giants had to pivot. And we hope that the pivot's going to, pan out for them.
Hope that pivots. You know what? But you made a really good point. For an extra extended here, that point about the cornerback room, right? So missing out, quote unquote, on Jonathon Brooks. I don't think that's really what it is. I think the pivot already happened when that board was unfolding at the top of the 2nd round and all those cornerbacks came off. In reality, it was, should the Giants have jumped up a few picks to get into that cornerback room rather than wait the way that they did, regardless of a running back going or not, regardless of Tyler Nubin being there or not? Where is the best value and could it have been worth? So if we sat here today and said, Tyrone Tracy Jr. is not on this roster, but that pick combined with 47 got them a few picks higher, and they grabbed one of those cornerbacks you mentioned, That's a different complexion. And when you go and sign Sailors, and when you bring in these other players, and you have Devin Singletary, you get Turbo Miller, you can start to sit here and say, well, guess what? I probably wouldn't care much one way or the other about what was happening in the running back room because there's always a body to get there versus feeling like a lingering question we're going to have going forward. Cordell Flott, Darnay Holmes, Herndon, as you mentioned, who's going to take over that position across from Tay Banks? Hey, that's the nature of the draft, though. You try your best, you try to trust your board, and we'll see behind the scenes when we get to that Hard Knocks coming up in July if there's some information around how the Giants felt going into that second round. That being the case, my friends, we've got another great episode coming up tomorrow talking about an interesting take around Daniel Bellinger that led us to ask, who are some surprising cut candidates for the New York Football Giants? We'll get into all of that, obviously, but in the meantime, you get over to YouTube, you check us out over on Twitter or X as well, at AMAC214, at Adam Armbrecht, and at One Giant Podcast, and get us on the podcast feed. Really, really helps us if you get over and subscribe over on the podcast feed as well. Thank you for doing all of that. And until next time, until the best times, as Andrew Macklitz would want, need, and demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.